2012 to save the last 10%, to create a behavior program revolving around behavior problems. So the goal was to bring the Dogs Playing for Life model to Austin Pets Alive to see if we could bring that from 90 as high as we can do it. And so that started in 2012. We formed that behavior department. Aaron was my right-hand man throughout all of it. I handed the reins over to Aaron and Marion Cannell, who's moved into now Dallas for operations, handed the reins over in 2016 for them to run the behavior department on their own. They don't need me anymore. They're incredible. But him and I are going to be just kind of free-flowing and talking through what we think are, it's an hour, right? This topic can be an entire weekend, right? We could spend all day Saturday, all day Sunday talking about this, and we still wouldn't get into everything. So this is an hour. We're going to try to keep things somewhat light, but we're going to try to keep things just very practical. And that's kind of what we pride ourselves on with all the work that we're doing with these dogs, is we want this to be practical solutions both for sheltering and for owners. And so we're not going to dive super deep into the behavioral science of some of this stuff, because even though that's crucially important, you understand the behavioral science. We have an hour. We want to make sure this is just practical stuff you can take home and actually apply. Does that make sense? Okay, sweet. So that's me. You got your mic.
Hey guys, I'm Aaron Caldwell. Been with Austin Pets Alive since late 2010, so I got to actually see the shift as Mike came in, brought the DPFL model along with him, and see the shift in the behavior of the dogs and the quality of life that came from that. So I got lucky to be brought under his wing, start running play groups, and begin the behavior modification process and providing basic obedience within the shelter itself. So I feel incredibly lucky to have this man next to me, and to have had him come in and really show us that things could be done. Interesting looking at APA before and after. Before, I think many of our dogs had some level of quality of life, but we never really saw changes in behavior. We essentially saw dogs either maybe getting a little bit better or maintaining, or in some ways showing some sort of regression in their behavior while they were with us. So now, when dogs are coming in, we're continually seeing a shift in a more beneficial light for them, making them more adaptable in the long run. So I think, today, as we're going through these slides, we're going to be talking both about dogs that are coming into our shelters with behavioral challenges, and then what we can do both in shelter and what we can be providing them in a home. So having said that, I think that's a good segue into our first slide.
Yeah, when they asked Aaron and I to talk about this topic, I don't know if you guys noticed, if you looked into the actual description of today, the differentiation was non-shelter created behavior problems. And we found that interesting because that's a lot, right? That's private dog training in a sense, right? That's dogs who have come now into your care with a history of behavior challenges. That's not the vast majority of dogs that we all experience in our care who are likely experiencing behavior problems created by being in the shelter, right? And so we're going to certainly talk about both of that. Monday we have a talk all about the 5 reasons that dogs are dying in shelter for behavior reasons, and we're going to be really diving even deeper on Monday into that. But for this talk, we're really trying to suss out, as you're allocating your resources in shelter, as you're trying to work with your dogs, what's a shelter-created behavior problem, which it usually is, and what is actual history for this dog that you've now learned about how they were in a previous home, a return, an owner surrender, a foster placement. That's kind of your first glimpse or your first insight into likely how they behave in the home. And so the challenge is that, okay, cool, we've learned that, but now they're in our care, in our shelter. How are we now going to set them up for success and get them ready for their now eventual adopter? And so those contextual differences can be really challenging. So you've learned about maybe you've counseled the adopter as they've returned their dog. Now you've learned the dog has some challenges in the home. Well, now they're back in your shelter. It would be cleanest if you could resolve those behaviors in the home environment, right? But they're with you. So how are you going to use that time wisely while they're with you and what can you do to try and develop that behavioral modification in your context, and then have it relate back into the home. Does that make sense? Right? Do you guys ever think about that? Because it's oftentimes it's what's in front of us. All right, the dog's jumping all over us. He's reactive at dogs, and we're putting all of our resources into that. But is that shelter-created behavior, or is that home behavior? And that allocation of resources is crucial. So the solution for us is, well, let's make sure we're setting these dogs up for success really whenever and wherever. So the dogs are in our care, we have to be providing training for them, and we have to generalize. And so we have to be able to say that these dogs are not just behaving well for Aaron, or for me. It's taboo at APA to say that the dog's, well, he's good for me, right? Because that's you're not doing your job if the dog's just behaving for you, but is not prepared for an adopter at all, right? And so that generalization is critical. We, of course, always have to be transparent and informative with our adoption counseling. So we're talking about this dog we believe has behavioral challenges in the home, not created by our shelter. Okay, so we have to be honest with our adopters, make sure that they feel ready to take this on, and feel ready to kind of work collaboratively with us. And then if you can, so at Awesome Pets Alive, one of the first programs we developed underneath the behavior program.
We're good? Great. Good? Sorry, guys.
All right. One of the first programs we created underneath the behavior program was our adoption follow-up program. So being able to actually follow our dogs when they went home, and knowing and having the confidence that if a challenge occurs in the home, whether we know it or not, right? Whether this is a dog that had behavioral history, or a dog who we think they're going to do well when they get home, but hey, who knows, right? Being able to still work with these adopters after the fact, so that adoption follow-up programs are critical for us at APA to be able to place more dogs and to save more dogs with behavioral challenges. So, we certainly urge you to be looking at your resources on where you could free up, either through partnerships in your community with private trainers, or through your own resources on how you can provide that follow-up training as well.
So before we get into the actual working piece of what we're doing both in shelter and in home with dogs, we wanted to talk through just the adoption process itself. So we have these dogs that are in the shelter, we know that they're coming in with prior behavioral challenges. How now do we find adopters for these dogs in the future? So when we're talking about this, I think a lot of times we get hung up in shelters in trying to diagnose the dog and then provide prescriptions for what the dog needs in the future. And those prescriptions, I think, can sometimes be a little bit dangerous. When we're thinking about the types of adopters that we want, we should be thinking more along the lines of general guidelines instead of rigid restrictions. If we're setting up too many walls for these dogs, it's likely that they're not going to find homes soon, or maybe not find homes at all, which could be dangerous. So what are we looking for? What are we actually looking for in an adopter when they're coming out? I think things that are components that are really important is looking for people that are open-minded, obviously eager to learn, willing to take in information as we're giving it to them. They're collaborative, they're willing to work with us, and we're seeing that right from the get-go. They're engaged, so they're taking in the information as we're giving it to them. Willingness to train and manage, and I think when we're talking about many of these behavioral challenges, we oftentimes get hung up on the training piece, that we want to train all of these behaviors out of a dog, we're hoping that an adopter will be training constantly with the dogs to make sure that they're improving on their behaviors. But we also have to consider that adopters don't work with dogs every day. We can provide that assistance, but we should also have some level of expectation that they're going to need to manage at home, that they're not always capable of training every minute of every day. And it's, when we're looking at adopters, if they're willing to apply those management techniques, that could open up a plethora of different homes depending on what behavioral challenges that we're looking at. And then the general home dynamics. So just looking at what the behavioral challenges that we know of prior, the information that we have on the dog, and what are the basic guidelines that we need for that dog to be successful. But again, not getting too hung up and creating definitive or rigid restrictions when it comes to that. What's not on the list? So what are we not necessarily looking at? And I think the first one that we're listing is a really important one to talk about, and that is experience. If we know that these guys are coming in with behavioral challenges, and we're looking for adopters, if we, for every dog that comes in that's had some sort of behavioral history, we're looking for an adopter out there that has a long, or has experience, is a trainer, is somebody that's worked through these behaviors before, we're going to get really hung up, and we're not going to be providing maybe the numbers that we're going to need to actually get these guys out into a home. Having said that, anecdotally speaking, I can say there are tons of adopters that have come to APA that have taken on dogs with certain challenges, and many of them come with zero experience and have provided the perfect household, and it's because they've shown those other characteristics that we're looking for, that eagerness, that willingness to learn, that ability to still apply training and management in a household environment, and then the adoption follow-up piece being a support piece to that, obviously providing them the guidance they need to be successful in the future. The other things we have on the list are socioeconomic status, physique or gender. I think sometimes with like really rough, really large dogs, we think, man, I really need a military man to take this dog home, and it's like, that may not be the case. If we can provide some training, if we can provide some management techniques, we don't always need to be looking at physique or gender as something that we should be considering in our matches for our dogs. The perfect home. If we have expectations of finding the perfect home for every dog, again, we're going to have a lot of dogs stuck in shelters for long periods of time.
And how many of you have ever thought this is the perfect home, and then the dog comes back, right? And then you take a chance, you're like, God, I don't know, roll the dice, I'm not sure if this is going to go well, and then the dog just flourishes, right? And so that's huge for us, but we felt like we needed to spend time on this because I think there's this perception that you can maybe roll the dice for your easy dogs, but for dogs that you have behavioral challenges, you've done some training with them, don't be reckless by any means, but we were shocked at how many of our best adopters were first-time dog owners. You guys have any of you who've done any kind of adoption counseling, you get that person who's like, I've owned dogs longer than you've been alive. Oh, okay. You're not listening to a single thing I'm saying now, right? But the person who's never owned a dog before, they're like, yeah, dude, tell me everything.
Yep.
Oh, got it. Read what book? Okay, got it. And they also kind of don't know that the dog is kind of a weirdo, right? Because they have no frame of reference. They're not comparing it to well, Fluffy used to be able to come to every party I ever had. They're not comparing it to their own dog, so they're just like, oh, it's not normal to have a dog that's going to bite someone who comes into my home. They don't even know, right? So it allows us to really, I think, and that's, obviously I'm being a little humorous, but it's actually kind of true in that they're not bringing in all these expectations and assumptions and this know-it-all mentality. So don't be afraid of those first-time dog owners. Those actually can be some of your best adopters of some of your harder to place dogs.
That's a great seg into our next segment, which is territorial aggression. There's a picture up there of my two dogs, both of them fairly territorial in the household. The one on the right, Maria, I adopted her before I had any dog experience whatsoever. So I came in without having any knowledge of what actually a home dog was going to look like. I didn't really know what I was doing. At the same time, in bringing her in, I was able to kind of figure things out on my own, and then also through the support of APA, be able to provide her what she needed to be successful within my household. So, having said that, so when we're talking about territorial aggression, what we're talking about here is a dog that's displaying some sort of aggressive behavior, such as barking, jumping, snapping, biting towards a human when the dog's territory is actually approached. Both of these girls, if a person were to just walk into my home, chances are they would not be too happy about that, and they would display probably all of those behaviors at the same time. This is when we're thinking about territorial aggression now in shelters. So the dog has come to us without prior notes. We're not necessarily going to know that in shelter. I think we have to consider contextual clues, so in shelter versus in home. When the dog gets into the shelter, we're likely not going to see those territorial behaviors pop up. We're not going to necessarily know if those behaviors would pop up at home. If If you actually look at the dog on the right, Little, she is a dog that in shelter loved everyone. Anyone could take her out, you could roll around with her, snuggle with her. Within 3 weeks of bringing her into the home, the people that were in the home were okay with her, but anyone else that was entering, she no longer was comfortable with. So it's taken some work to get her back in comfortable. So again, it's going to be hard to know necessarily, just in shelter, whether or not dogs are going to display these behaviors. What we have to go off of is prior notes. Dogs coming back from foster, dogs coming back from an adoptive home, or being owner surrendered into our care, for us really to know that this is potentially something we're going to need to work through. So looking at territorial aggression in shelter, because we're likely not going to actually see this behavior in shelter, what do we do? How do we deal with this? How do we work with this? And I think an important way to look at territorial aggression while the dog is with us is thinking that we need to start to provide them the tools that they'll potentially need once they get into a home environment. What are these tools? What do we want to try to start working them through? That would be obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, that would be something like place or down work. When we say place and down work, it's essentially starting to train our dogs to replace this idea of wanting to protect and or growl, snap, display, or have those aggressive displays, and instead go do something else. Go elsewhere and maintain until your handler has given you another cue. Now, having said that, we're going to play a video here of Leonidas really quick.
Yeah, so, and just really quick framework, we picked some of the behaviors that we see crop the most, that the behaviors that we end up in shelter having to say, okay, how are we going to actually teach the dog coping skills and successful behaviors? How do we save this dog when we know that contextually in shelter, he's not in the environment that we're actually really able to resolve it in, right? So we picked the behaviors that are most common for us. We could, again, there's thousands of behaviors that we could try to train through. Territorial aggression comes up. It's one of our most commonly called upon behaviors with our adoption follow-up program. People can't have friends come over easily. They're going to call us, and we're going to need to try to resolve that. And so to Aaron's point, in shelter, there's really no behavior assessment, or really there's nothing contextually in shelter that's going to really show that to you, because they're not in a home, and they don't have that relationship like they have with an owner, right? So often this goes under the radar, and we, as a result, we can't necessarily confidently say we fixed the whole thing when it's time for adoption, but we've put the building blocks in place. And so this place video that I'm going to play for you. So we created some training videos at Austin Pets Alive to help with our adopters and help with all of the training that we do. And so I'm not going to play the entire video because it's like 8 minutes to the next level. And I'll probably shut myself up on the video.
What you guys just heard though was a knock at the door and then Amy actually calling out place to Leonidas. So as the knock happened, she was trying to start creating an environment with you. Knock happens at the door, Leonidas, I need you to go to place each and every time that happens. And at least in this case, Leonidas was able to do it very well. Amy then put him on tie down, obviously gave him a comfortable place to hang out while the stranger has now entered the space.
No, you're good, thank you, man. And so this is one of our favorite replacement behaviors. So for a lot of what we're talking about today, we're talking about replacement behaviors. We're talking about teaching dogs a behavior to do instead of the unwanted behavior. So for territorial aggression, place is a behavior we teach almost all of our dogs in shelter. So if you're gonna write anything down today, teach your dogs place when they're in shelter with you, because it's so useful to combat so many unwanted behaviors, territorial issues being one of them. So we're simulating in this kind of mock training situation here what you'd set up in the home. You'd find something heavy to anchor a tie down to, either create a tie down like an eye hook in the wall, get a leash and tether it around like a heavy table leg, and you were teaching this dog to go to place on command, make sure that's rock solid. Now, have that tie down installed as just like an intermediate step until you can trust the dog will actually hold the downstay when the stranger walks in. So have that tie down there. And then you're practicing setting that dog to place as soon as someone comes and knocks on the door. The goal there being that the knock on the door, as Aaron was talking about, becomes the environmental cue. So knock, 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 dog knows, dude, 100 times in a row, whenever there's been a knock, you make me go to place. So I'm just gonna go to place on the 101st time, right? Like, I get it, that's what you want me to do. And so that's what we'd be recommending in the home. That's how we'd be working with our adopters. So in shelter, we're going to try to simulate this stuff as much as we can. Does that make sense, that technique? And then as you can see what Amy's doing, she's rewarding the behavior we want. She's rewarding the dog for any calm, quiet, relaxed behavior while he's on tie down. We're not being sticklers on his holding his down stay at this point. We're just happy with the fact that he's hanging out calm and quiet, and we're going ahead and rewarding that. You can then get the visitor, so to speak, in on the act as well, and they can be tossing some food too. So we've got some operant conditioning, we've got some classical conditioning, we've got this kind of a lot of information being given to the dog. If he's barking and growling and carrying on, we're just ignoring that. That doesn't work. That didn't achieve the desired outcome. The person doesn't leave, and we're trying to really not be like, hey, knock it down, quiet, because that's still feedback, right? That's still kind of a reaction. So we're really going with that negative punishment, taking away our attention, we're ignoring that altogether, and then we're going ahead and positive reinforcing behavior we do want. But we're also taking the behavior that we don't want off the table completely by setting him to place, putting him on tie down, and then that tie down can leave when we feel like the dog's advanced enough, and we'll hold that down, but we don't need to really rush into that. So that's the video, guys.
So I think another important component to really understand, though, is in shelter, this isn't the home environment. So while the dog's in shelter, while we're working through these training components for territorial aggression in the future, we should also be realizing we need to get these dogs to generalize and do this in as many different environments as possible. So varying the handler and varying the environment. So the dog is learning that not just in this one place do I need to be performing these behaviors, but this can happen in different environments, different rooms, different spaces, and the same behaviors are going to be required each and every time. Cool. So moving on to territorial aggression in home. So what do we do now the dog is in a home and we're likely going to start seeing some of these behaviors pop up? Generally speaking, we're talking about the same techniques that we've taught the dog in shelter. Now we're just translating that actually into the home environment. And that could come through adoption follow-up, some sort of support from your team to be teaching those that are in, or the adopters, how to provide, or how to continue these techniques in that home space.
And those of you that are foster-based as well.
Yeah, there you go.
There's, this is also how we would want to work with it in the home in general. If you're foster-based, the goal is to also maybe send them to another foster after they're great, they're doing all this in foster, sweet, send them to a second foster, or third foster. I know it's kind of pie in the sky, but it's so that, again, you can generalize. It's still important to generalize in foster, but you're way better set up to actually tackle it if they're in foster.
Yeah, and having said that, once the dog is in a home, from a generalization piece, if we're trying to get that dog set up in that home space, we're no longer as worried with an adopter of getting the dog into multiple different environments. Now the dog is in the environment we expect them to be in for hopefully the rest of their life. So we're spending most of our time working on it within that space. Beyond that, we can begin counter-conditioning exercises with just human presence so that the dog can learn that human presence is more beneficial than they had once thought. And this can come through modification of feeding schedule. And when we say modifying their feeding schedule, what we mean there is instead of just feeding them out of a bowl or feeding them out of a puzzle toy every day at a certain time, why not take that food and provide it to the strangers that are coming into the home and have the dog start to see those strangers as potentially providing them the sustenance they need on a daily basis. Now, obviously that can't happen every day, but if you know that you're planning to have somebody over at 5 p.m., you usually feed your dog sometime around that period of time anyway, why not portion out that food and provide that to the handler that's coming over, utilizing tie-down, place work, etc. We can add the food to it and allow them to hopefully see that new person in a more beneficial way.
Yeah, we do that a lot with all of this stuff is, all right, well, he's on a pretty consistent training plan. All right, so he gets 4 cups of food a day. Cool. Throw that in the big Tupperware container on your kitchen counter or in shelter, and great, just dip into that throughout the day as you're training so that, 1, the dog's not getting fat, but 2, cool, sweet, I'm working for my food, I'm on it, right? I'm not like, you know what? I ate already, I think I'm good, Quick question on that?
Yeah, so on this, and we might move into it
Yeah.
a little bit, but what about the dogs that are just not food motivated, they just don't care?
Sure. We didn't bring that up because that sucks. And so, yeah, and so obviously if you're trying to like modify feeding schedule for a dog who's not that food motivated, it's tough. We try sometimes to see like, are you just being picky? We'll wait you out a little bit, but we don't like starve the dog and have him just be like super hungry all the time either. So we certainly try to get creative with what types of food, especially if there's like, you only get this like incredible chopped up meat only during training, right? Like, the only time you ever get this is during training. At the end of the day, if they aren't food motivated, and we see that, we certainly see that in shelter a lot too, we will certainly utilize a lot of pressure and release, a lot of negative reinforcement, where we're at least trying to teach the dogs, if you're far away from me, that's when you feel leash pressure. If you're near me, pressure off. This is a whole day long, DPFL does a whole Monsters Unleashed presentation on this. Those dogs are telling us, hey, food is not a positive for me. If they have other positives, toys, petting, praise, we're gonna try to find those things that are rewards for them. You do sometimes in shelter find those dogs who none of that's actually a reward to them. And so that's when we go to that pressure and release and at least start to teach them, you're next to me, pressure's off completely. So we are really picky on when you're walking your dogs. Don't be walking like they're in a suitcase. Like they should be, near you should be the sweet spot, the most comfy place there is, no pressure at all on you. It's just if you're out of position, that leash pressure occurs. Not like old-fashioned popping, just like that negative reinforcement stuff. And that often brings us to a place where that's the first time the dog has any feedback of, oh, cool, so I guess being near you is the right thing to do, or sitting is the right thing to do, and then the appetite can kind of come from there. But that's the quickest I can probably get into that. Was that helpful?
Yeah.
Sweet. Management.
Just talking through management. So I think, me living with this personally on a daily basis, there are oftentimes, I know that it will take my dogs usually between 2 or 3 days to really bond to a new person coming into my home, that I can feel comfortable taking them on the tie down, letting them loose, and they're okay with their presence. So management comes in huge for me all the time. Utilization of crate, utilization of a spare room, utilizing tie downs while people are in the space, just knowing that while people are over, my dogs are likely not coming off of tie down, but that's okay. It's that willingness to be able to manage in the home that allows them to be so successful. I think we can all expect a guest at least at some point in our household, maybe not every day, and important to remember that management is a piece that we should be willing to utilize for our dogs.
For sure. We'll talk about management a few times throughout the day, just because that's when we say saving behavior dogs or solving behavioral issues, I think that there has to always be a component of, well, what pieces are we going to have to manage? And so I think that's a crucial component of it. All right, next behavior, on-leash reactivity. So I think we've all experienced that dog on leash that is pulling, lunging, barking, high-pitched vocalizing. We see that again in shelter all the time, right? Our shelters are kind of a breeding factory for on-leash reactivity. We do see that occur in the home at times as well. Sometimes we have dogs return for that. We have dogs who the adopters contact us. This is again, in the top 3 reasons our adoption follow-up program ever gets called. If you can't bring your friends over, and if you can't go out on a walk with your dog. That nationwide seems to be some of the most common reasons we get called for adoption follow-up. And so we know that there can be several motivations for on-leash reactivity. That's what OLR is. We like talking in acronyms all the time. So it can be really fear, frustration, anxiety. It can be aggression, but we're always going to be yelling at you. You cannot diagnose aggression purely based on leash reactivity or barrier reactivity for that matter. You can call that reactivity, but do not call that aggression unless you actually find out the dog intent after that barrier or that leash is gone, okay? So to my grave, I will be telling you stop calling that aggression, call that reactivity. And I'm not gonna rant, but stop calling aggression reactivity as well, right? I see that a lot with trainers these days. Well, he's really reactive. Well, no, he's actually legitimately dog aggressive. And that's okay. But don't call him reactive, because then all the reactive dogs get lumped in with him, and just, right? Let's just start being straight. I won't rant. So in shelter, so some common threads here in that, again, replacement behaviors. We're really big on replacement behaviors, and we're going to keep saying that. in shelter, we have to still differentiate, is this in shelter? Is this in home behavior? Do we have any history of this dog behaving this way in the home? Yes or no? If we don't, it doesn't guarantee that they're not going to behave that way in the real world. So it's still worth our efforts to try to modify, to try to train that behavior so that we can make them the most successful adoption candidates. When you see replacement behaviors, we're talking about conditioning eye contact. Conditioning these dogs that eye contact is the greatest thing there is in the world, but we are not cueing it. So we're not teaching a look command or a watch me. We feel it's a little kindergartnery. We want the dogs to actually generalize and be like, oh dude, I don't need you to tell me. I just have been conditioned that another dog in the environment, boom, that's my cue. Checking in with you, what are we doing, dude? That's what we want them to learn, not stare, 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 stare. I haven't heard look yet, so stare, stare, right? We don't want it to be a step ahead of them always. We want them to be able to learn that stuff on their own. Those are better coping skills in our opinion. And so real quick, just a quick little video on this major look game. So for dogs that we want to kind of get a head start on teaching that eye contact, Amy there has food in both of her fists. She's just hanging out there. She's not saying a word. She's just standing there neutral. She's waiting for the dog. I think that was Nora. She's waiting for, man, it was like 3 years ago, I remember. She's waiting for Nora. Nora's just trying to figure out, how do I get you to open up those hands? I want that food. Pawing at her hand, no, that's not working. Sitting, that's not working. Glance up at Amy, mark it, yes. Open up one of your hands. And just kind of keep varying in between hands, which when you open, basic stuff, you guys, but this is just conditioning the dog to get eye contact. And we're not cueing it, we're not calling for it, she's learning to do it. Okay, so just a little game you can play to encourage eye contact. Now, we bring this eye contact into now real world settings. So Amy has a dog, we've got a dog out on the other side of that field, and Amy is just starting to condition that looking away from the other dog is the cue. Well, so what Amy's doing, this is the first time this dog's ever been out, and with this exercise. There's a dog over there, and so Amy's just waiting for that moment where the dog sees the other dog, and then looks away, and then we're marking and rewarding that, and then we're building off of that. The dog may not be able to understand right away that I should look at you, but you find your critical distance, that distance you can be at from the other dog, where they see the dog, they've acknowledged the dog, but they're not past their threshold yet, they can still hold it together, and you wait for that moment where they disengage and look away, mark and reward, okay? Marker training, we love marker training, either clicking, verbal marker, yes, then food. And so what we're doing there is we're shaping this behavior, we're conditioning this behavior that looking away from the dog, but then as we get through the session, we get pickier, and we stop rewarding just looking away. And we're going to fine-tune that until the dog's actually looking directly at us. Okay, so you can see she's already picking up on that in this session. And that's what we mean, the difference between cueing and shaping the behavior. So we are conditioning, this is our go-to for reactivity, to be able to teach these guys, other dog in the environment means checking with your handler. Then we can start to close that distance and start to continue to do this as we get closer. But then we can throw other things at them, start teaching them how to do some nice working walk and eye contact. Sit, down, come, all these other behaviors in the presence of other dogs, all while encouraging these behaviors that are more incompatible to lunging and barking and whatnot. So those replacement behaviors are critical for us. And we often will go to gentle leaders for our equipment. And so I don't even know if training tools, cool. So we love head halters for reactivity. We are tool junkies. We'll use pretty much anything as long as it gets us to rewardable behavior, and the dogs are happy, rewardable behavior, happy dogs, adoptable behavior, right? That's what we're looking for. We don't really care what the tool is if it gets us there. We've just seen, more often than not, reactivity behaviors tend to do best with head halters. We tend to see that we have control of their head. That way, if we turn directions, their head has to follow us, as opposed to a harness where they can still be turning and talking smack, right? Okay.
And even just talking through that coping mechanism of, instead of cueing eye contact, having the dog just be environmentally conditioned to show it. I don't know for you guys, but think of walking a dog, think of being surprised by another dog entering that space, and then think of having to try to manage the dog through it. Or instead, the dog just knowing, hey, I see another dog and I check in with my handler. That like autopilot, the ability for the dog to know exactly what they need to do in that given moment, for me as a handler, I think is huge. And we're only gonna get there if we move away from the cueing piece and just have that expectation environmentally when these stimuli are popping up.
And so you're going to probably see this on almost every slide, but playgroup is our go-to for most things. Our whole behavior department is built around playgroup as the foundation. And so we're going to harp on it a lot because you have to be able to differentiate between what's worth your training resources and what is just a bored, frustrated dog. And usually, if you're not actually getting your dogs out every day, if your dogs aren't physically and emotionally satisfied, you're going to be trying to train all these dogs out of all these really naughty behaviors when the vast majority of them aren't going to behave that way, when they're just getting out and they're getting exercised and they're playing. And so playgroups is certainly crucial for all of it. It's especially crucial for unleash reactivity because we got to diagnose what's behind the reactivity, right? Is this actually aggression? Is this frustration? Is this fear? So playgroup can get to the bottom of that, and it allows us again to allocate those resources a lot more responsibly. We don't have, right? If we have 200-something dogs, we can't train every single dog every single day, but we can get them out, and then that can allow us to then triage who actually gets the training resources, right? I think we're gonna speed up. We're talkers.
Yeah. Sorry, guys.
All right, so in the home, it's really a lot of the same stuff. We still really believe in those replacement behaviors. We really believe that these coping mechanisms, it's these abilities for dogs to be faced with various things in life and to say, hey, I know what I'm supposed to do here. We put bat training on here because it's really commonly used. People love bat training from what I've seen when it comes to reactivity. We're not huge fans in that it's not realistic in your shelter. Because for bat to be successful, you're really staying out of threshold, right? You're wading into the water. You can't do that in shelter. Your threshold's already blown because they're in a kennel with other dogs all over the place, right? So we certainly pull components of bat out in shelter, but it can be helpful for your adopters or your owners if you're working in a home environment, if the dog himself has such a long threshold, you're starting from very far away. Often we go to it if the adopters themselves really want a really slow, methodical approach. They're not comfortable, they're not very good handlers. We might go to bat. We also tend to still stick with a lot of this obedience and these replacement behaviors because I don't know about you guys if you've done any private training, but I've been to a lot of houses where you step out the door and it's this busy apartment complex and there's still dogs everywhere, And I don't want to limit our adoption pool to just like people with ranches, And so I think it's still, for us, really gets to the root of the problem and it gets to solutions quicker when we can really start to develop those obedience behaviors. All right, go.
Okay, so talking through over-arousal. First things first, I think when it comes to over-arousal, we're likely going to potentially see more of this in shelter just due to the environment itself. When we're thinking about over-arousal, we're thinking about jumpy behaviors, we're thinking about mouthy behaviors, we're thinking about leash climbing or body slamming. All of this, again, we can potentially see a reason for a shelter creating some of these behaviors. Now, here we're obviously talking about behaviors that we see in home and we potentially see in the shelter itself. But thinking about over-arousal, again, exacerbated in shelter, how do we help them now? First thing on the list, like we were saying before, playgroup. Let's get them out. Let's give them an ability to burn that energy, both mental and physical. If we can burn that energy, do we see a drastic shift from a bunch of jumpy and mouthy behavior to a fairly calm dog? I know that at APA specifically, in the mornings, things tend to be a little bit hectic, dogs just wanting to get out initially. We take them out for their morning outing, they go out to playgroup, they get back to their kennels, and by evening outing, they are calm, cool, relaxed, because they have that ability to burn that energy. Place and down on environmental cues. So we talked through this a lot in territorial aggression. but being able to apply replacement behaviors to that jumping on behavior, dog is jumping up on us, instead we send that dog away, and they're able to perform a sustained sit on a placemat. This can be incredibly helpful with this behavior.
It's the same exact thing we talked through with territorial aggression.
Exactly.
It's just the motivation of the dog is different, right?
Yeah.
But it's the same stuff, which is why go teach place to all your dogs.
That's right. Place, players. And then tie-down exercises. So when I say tie-down exercises, we have a video. We talked a little bit before in territorial aggression about finding a secure thing, something secure to tie your dog down to. This is Gilbert in this video.
Yeah, this is something we do in shelter a lot and in the home a lot, where we just set up that tie-down, clip the dog to the tie-down, get as many people as you want. This is actually great for like new volunteers. You're trying to get in and kind of bring them on in so that they can join your programs. Line up, and the first person that goes is walking up. If that dog's got 4 on the floor or their butt on the ground, wherever that dog is in their training, but at least 4 on the floor, if not butt on the ground, you're walking all the way up and petting. If that butt pops up or if they get 2 paws up off the ground, you're out. So as you can see in the video, Amy and I are taking turns, butts on the ground, going in, petting, great. Now I go to the back of the line, the next person goes. And so that generalization, get as many people as you can in these training sessions. And so Gilbert was a dog that we definitely saw. Yeah, he's very vertical, he loves to jump on people. And so this is useful for Gilbert, but it's also, again, it's something is a go-to for those really rude dogs who they're friendly, but they're just like up in your personal space, greeting you in your chin, right? This is a great exercise for that. Does that exercise make sense?
And it's fairly easy. Like
really
I said, you can pretty much toss anyone into this role and they can understand dog jumps up, I back away, dog's got 4 on the floor, I'm going forward and actually petting. So it doesn't take an expert to be able to do it. Okay, so talking through a few other things. So drop, just teaching a dog that on cue, if asked, they need to drop whatever it is they have in their mouth. This can be especially helpful if a dog were a leash climber. And when I say leash climbing, I mean grabbing at the leash and or climbing up it while they're walking. We see this often in shelter just due to the frustration of being present around other dogs, maybe not having a ton of outings outside of the kennel. I think this can oftentimes foster or build behavior in that environment. Bounce. So when we talk about bounce, it's a fairly simple game again, doesn't take an expert, but we're placing a dog on a leash. We're tacking that leash with our foot. When I say tacking the leash with our foot, I mean we are placing the leash on the ground, we're putting our foot over it in a way that the dog is not feeling pressure while it is seated or has its 4 paws on the ground. However, if it does jump up, the moment it gets up off the ground, we want our foot to be in a position that automatically pressure is going to be felt. The moment the dog goes back down, that pressure goes away. Oftentimes we do this with the treat, so we're almost kind of teasing the dog into potentially breaking 4 on the floor, but we start with the treat high, we start to lower that treat down. If the dog goes to jump up, again, that pressure is felt immediately. Once they're up, the moment they're down, that pressure goes away. Another thing happens though too is we're going to, the moment the dog jumps up, bring the treat back up. So we're teaching them both with pressure and release. What's more beneficial for them, along with where the treat is. Closer, or if the dog is maintaining 4 on the floor, the treat's going to keep coming down towards their face. If the dog decides to jump up, exactly, we're bringing it back up. And the hope is that fairly quickly we're going to teach that dog maintain that 4 on the floor, and that treat will sooner than later enter your mouth. And then just basic obedience. So providing the dogs a general sense of what they should be doing, how they should be performing both on leash and or in a open setting with another human animal.
Yeah, so you heard in Dr. J's presentation earlier, if you were at that, about our CGC Ready program. And we threw that program together because we were doing a lot of training with a lot of our dogs, but this packaged program, if you're gonna pass that test, the Canine Good Citizen test, you gotta handle all those 10 tests, right? And so if the dog has arousal issues, well, cool, we're trying to address it, but the CGC test already calls for a dog who can politely greet a person, not climb all over them, not hard mouth them. So let's just train to pass the tests. That program resulted actually in an 80% decrease in length of stay for adult pit bull type dogs for the first 2 years that we were studying a control population versus the CGC population. So it's an incredible program that you guys should all do. But the cool thing is it's just obedience training. We're just packaging it in that program. So this is the friendly stranger test for a dog who was practicing for CGC. So our dogs in shelter are always so desperate for attention. So you feel terrible for them, but we've got to be able to teach them these skills. So this is friendly stranger. The dog's not going to get adopted if meeting a person results in them just jumping all over them, hard-mouthing them, and so that's how we prep for that. We can efficiently get through those arousal issues by just saying, well, great, the dog's in the CGC program. That's one of the things he has to work through anyways. We're going to keep going. Ask your question at the very end. Thank you. And we're the last talk, so we can just hang out.
Talking through body slamming, jumpy, mouthy behavior, Mr. Jones, the dog you just saw, have a human approach, actually go to pet, was doing all of those things not that far before that test was actually done. So providing that basic obedience really brought him far above and beyond what we were seeing initially as he came into the shelter.
He was also a playgroup dog.
He was also a playgroup, yes.
He would go to playgroup,
yep.
And then he'd get out for training.
Yep.
If we were just focusing on training that behavior, if he was not getting out for playgroup, not even worth your time.
Totally. Okay, so how to work with overarousal in the home. Now, obviously our hope is if the dog is not in a shelter environment where these behaviors are being exacerbated, maybe we're actually going to see some of that regress in the home. We're going to see less of the behavior in the actual household. Why are we seeing it? So boredom, pent-up energy, we shouldn't see as much of that present in the household, hopefully because as adopters, we're taking our dogs out for walks, we're giving them outings in backyard spaces, playing fetch with them, other dog-dog experiences, all of these things, and just the human contact itself. These dogs are likely going to be around a human or having interactions more than they would in a shelter environment. As for what do we do for training? Essentially, all the stuff we just talked about in shelter, same things apply to the home. Now it's just up to these adopters to put in the time, actually provide these guys the assistance that they need. And I think in saying that, it's, them putting in the time is really important, but the second piece of that is us being able to help them know what to do and how to apply all of those things that we've taught in shelter, now in the home environment. And then the last piece is just making sure that owners are on the same page. Multiple owners in a home. If one owner is saying, well, I like when the dog jumps on me, and is reinforcing that behavior, the chance that in the long run we're going to be changing that behavior for good is going to be fairly minimal. The dog feels like, half the time it's beneficial for them to be jumping up. We're likely not going to see any sort of sustained change. Management techniques, tie down. Use of crate or a separate room. Obviously, ample opportunities to be burning excess energy, walks, runs, fetch, and then puzzle toys. Making sure that we're not just thinking in terms of burning physical energy, but we're also thinking in terms of burning mental energy for dogs.
All right, so we deal with this a lot as well. So fear, and then when fear also becomes defensive, right? And so we always want to differentiate when there's a dog that is fearful, but man, they have no defense. They're hiding. They're just, I'm not here. I'm not here. You can go pick them up, and they're terrified, but they have no defense. Versus the dog who will protect themselves if they feel like flight is not an option, right? It's important to differentiate always between offensive and defensive aggression. We're talking about a dog who perceives that flight is not an option, so all they're left with is fight, and that's still fear-based. It's a dog who's willing to defend themselves versus the dog who kind of just goes into that comatose catatonic, I'm not here state, Both challenging, both things we see, and whether we see that in shelter or in the home, it's, the dog's with us, right? So now we have to figure out how are we going to resolve this. We love this technique called the flexi routine. I'm going to play the video. This is a fearful dog in APA's care who, once we started doing the flexi routine, actually it went way quicker than we thought it would go, but it's kind of a good example of the power of it. So fearful dogs, you put them on a 6-foot leash, and that's kind of punishment, right? They don't want to be next to you, likely. And so we see a lot of power in putting, I know flexi leash, oh God, right? Using a flexi leash, I used to cut them and throw them away when I used to get them, right? But it's funny, what's more polarizing, flexi leashes or e-collars, right? right? So on Flexi, it's very powerful, we think, for the dog to have the opportunity to be far away from us if they want. That choice for the scared dog to say, I don't want to be next to you, but then they can choose to close down the distance. So the handler is looking for opportunities where at any distance the dog chooses to be at, if she checks in with the handler, we're just briefly marking either yes or clicker. Sometimes the clicker might scare them if they're scaredy dogs. I'm blinded by the light. What? 10 minutes, got it. Thank you. So, we're looking for that brief moment of checking in, and then we want to mark that and just toss the food. We're not even really paying close attention to the dog. We're being very nonchalant. But the fact that that dog has the opportunity to be like 16 feet away from you and then be getting some feedback even from 16 feet, oh, I checked in, got some food. We threw the food. We're let them pick it up, kind of just let them pick it up. We're not really like, oh, here's the food. And then over time, and in this video it was actually pretty immediate, the dog can start to actually choose to close that gap themselves. And then the goal is to be able to be just hand feeding them right next to you. Once you've got them hand feeding right next to you on walks, this is the hard part. Stop handling the dog, get the next person to start doing that. For scaredy dogs in shelter, a lot of us make this mistake of, well, that's Susie's dog. So Susie's gonna come every day and work with her, and now this dog loves Susie, but is beside herself if Susie's not there, right? And so that dog's not any better off for adoption. So this Flexi routine, great, go do Flexi, awesome, get that dog making that decision to actually close the gap themselves, comfortable walking next to you, taking food. Great, next handler, same thing, get them to that point, next handler, great. Now the dog's got a pool of people that they're actually comfortable being next to, and now we can start doing things like hand targeting. Now the dog's cool being next to us, and now we can start to teach the dog that hands, coming for them, reaching for them is actually now associated with good stuff. So hand targeting is another really good exercise for these scaredy dudes. Does that Flexi routine make sense? Did any of you guys think that you'd walk away from here with a way to use a Flexi routine? Or flexi leash? Yeah. What's up? In the dog?
You're using the Flexi leash in the dog.
In the dark, yes.
Yes,
We can be shameful, Flexi users, yes. And so, of course, we're in a Heart-Bond play group too. Tomorrow, I hate the clickbait, but on Monday at our next presentation, we're going to show you a pretty cool video that we show a lot in DPFL shows to show the power of playgroup with scared dogs, because it can really expedite how quickly you can reach your scared dogs. It's the first thing we do for scared dogs in shelter, the very first thing we do, because it's going to take you a long time, usually, to get through to the scared dogs. If you can't find something that's really, really rewarding and really quickly makes them feel at ease in your shelter, then oftentimes other dogs can do that. I think I know enough about generalization. Yeah, good. All right, and then so now defensive behaviors. This video right here, really good example of, again, replacement behaviors. This is the adopter of a dog who we knew after a return, who was returned for being defensive to people walking up to him and his handler on walks. So we worked on it in shelter, but then again, perfect example, we had to work with the adopter. We set it up, hey, we'll continue training with you if you adopt this dog. So this is on Town Lake, right next to the Austin, not right next to APA, and I'm just grabbing people on the trail and sending them over to Tiana and Bo, and we are teaching Bo that people walking up, the audio is actually better than me right now, but the people walking up is an environmental cue to check in with the handler. So you can see he's offering these behaviors. Tiana is on a variable reinforcement schedule. She's rewarding with food sometimes, she's rewarding with petting sometimes she's not rewarding because he's pretty advanced at this point. And so Tiana's not saying a word to him, we're just teaching him that the approach of a person up to you and your mom, it is not lunge and bite, it's check in with mom and await further notice, right? So that's just, I think, a perfect example of our go-to for, so you can replace this with any stimulus, right? If the issue was dogs, we could just have dogs be the stimulus. But his issue was people approaching him when he was on leash. The training remains the same. Yeah, we're gonna go back right there. Of course, if there's any just like actual specific fears, right? If there's instance, we're going to go just real classic conditioning to change the dog's whole association to said stimulus, right? I think that's the easier stuff when the dog has a very specific fear or a specific phobia. You can really go through a pretty clean, clinical, classical conditioning, for that. When the dogs have more generalized fears, or they're just kind of in general a fearful dog, or again, when the fear becomes defensive, that's when we dig in, even deeper. Does that all make sense? Sweet.
Okay.
Separation anxiety.
So talking through separation anxiety, this is actually a dog I used to live with named Buckley. Bringing him into our home, if we left him for any period of time, he would turn rectangular crates into spheres. And he would take a crate from the kitchen to the living room. He enjoyed the taste of couches and obviously doors. It was a challenging dog, bringing him into the home. And what we were dealing with there was in leaving him alone, he would start to feel a high level of anxiety. Now, when we're talking about separation anxiety itself, in that handler leaving the dog for a period of time, it can vary greatly in severity. So there's times where separation anxiety may just be a dog whining or barking within a kennel space. This could go all the way to a dog actually causing physical injury to themselves. What we want to make sure when we're talking about separation anxiety is that we're actually properly diagnosing it. I think many times boredom is misdiagnosed as separation anxiety to that point that the dog Buckley in that door situation, even though he came to us with separation anxiety, we spent years working him through it to a point that he was comfortable and fine when we would leave the house. This was maybe 6 years into his stay in the home, and he simply got bored, learned that if he swiped at a door, sometimes they would open, and in this case, that door didn't open this time, and he just kept swiping at the door until he placed a holder. So again, important that we're really looking at the context or the reason for why we're seeing behaviors. Is it truly separation anxiety, or is this simply a dog that's bored and doesn't have enough outlets, and then how do we provide those dogs the outlets they need to hopefully not be bored while we're gone? Okay, so separation anxiety and shelter. The tough piece is going to be that dogs coming into the shelter environment are likely not going to display separation anxiety. We're not going to see it there. It's going to be hard to diagnose within that environment itself. So, knowing that we're not going to see the behavior, what do we do to work on it? And just like territorial aggression, it's not that we're going to be able to tackle it head on. We're not probably going to be able to proof this behavior in shelter, but what we can do is provide training techniques that will hopefully help the dog be more successful in the future once in a household. So, training, behavior modification in shelter. What can we do? Crate training. So just getting the dog comfortable, getting in and out of a crate space, hanging out in a crate space for brief periods of time, even while the human is still around. This could be incredibly helpful in the future once the dog is in a home. Starting counter conditioning exercises with the crate. So getting the dog to see it as more beneficial if there's any fear initially, and potentially beginning the process of counter-conditioning weeding process within a room. So if we place a crate within an office space, we hang out with them for a period of time, and we start to break down the weeding process there. That could potentially be helpful in the future in a home environment. It's not going to fix the problem, but it's a tool that it's one component that could be utilized to hopefully see some progress or faster progress once the dog actually does get home. Use of sleepovers, field trips, short-term fosters, an ability to get a dog out actually into the environment where we're going to see the behavior is going to give us more ample opportunities to actually work on it. I think a fear of this would be if we're sending dogs into a home and then we're bringing them directly back into the shelter, and then we're sending dogs into a home and then bringing them directly back into a shelter, could we not create worse separation anxiety for the dog in the long run? And at least Maggie's Fund was able to do a study about a year or two back that showed within 2 weeks, so if we send a dog into a household environment for 2 weeks or less, there was no actual data to state that anxiety went up in the future when the dog actually got into a home environment. So utilizing these short-term fosters or these sleepovers or these home field trips, we do believe still serves a benefit without too much worry that we're actually making that behavior worse.
Yeah, we've been able to see in some cases the work that we do in shelter, as Aaron was describing, getting the crate trained, and then at least just simulating being left alone in certain offices and crates. We've been able to see some cases where we at least were able to build like an hour or so, a 2-hour threshold, and that at least allowed us to find an adopter, because we were at least able to say, you can go grocery shopping and then come back, and we can build off of that, right? If they had 0 threshold, that's a lot harder, but we could say, hey, we think that you can at least run to the store, and then they can build off of that. It's better to build off of like a 2-hour threshold than a 10-minute threshold. And so I don't think there's been enough. That'd be probably a great study that we could probably do if we had the time and the funding to actually study that. But we've been able to see that be enough of a trend, and our volunteers have been really huge at that piece, doing a lot of that easy, just kind of threshold work. That's been pretty big for us to play separation with the dogs.
Okay, so how do we work on it in home? And I think a lot of these exercises that we were just talking about that we're trying to do in shelter, we're now going to translate into the home environment. The lucky piece is if we're going to see separation anxiety there, then we're maybe hitting the problem more head on. So with these counter conditioning exercises with the crate, instead of potentially looking at it being helpful in the future, we're helping the dog in that moment. Food modification. So I think sometimes we do all of this counter conditioning work in the crate, but we don't think about maybe how, when we're even gone, can we make the crate space or our leaving more beneficial to the dog. So if we're planning to only be gone for short periods of time, and we're trying to get the dog to see our leaving in a more beneficial light, why not modify their food schedule to revolve around the leaving process itself? Every time I go to leave for an hour or two, I place down a portion of your daily food at that time. Is it likely that a dog with true separation anxiety is going to eat that food right away? Maybe not. Maybe they're going to be too stressed out to actually do that. But the hope is that over time, and if that is continually how they're getting their food, they're going to see, okay, well, I keep getting food, I keep having these opportunities, I keep not taking them, but I'm feeling a little bit less stressed out. Maybe this time when mom or dad leaves me, I will actually take this opportunity to eat. Now, when we're talking about medication, I think it is important to realize that we would want to only utilize medication if we were also attempting something in the Travere or VMOD route, that it shouldn't just be looked at as a cure-all. But there are certain cases that we may be doing all of this training and behavior modification work, and it's just not making any impact on the dog whatsoever. But there's the potential that by adding medication, we're just able to take enough of that edge off that we can actually see some progress being made while we continue again the VMOD training pieces. Management. So taking the dog with you, not always going to be possible, but in Austin it feels like it's more possible. There's the places that will allow it. Modifying your schedule, even just if you're a person that goes to work, 6-8 hours a day, but you're able to take a lunch break, that could at least shorten the periods of time that the dog is left alone. Daycare for pet sitters, so true management, just placing the dog into another environment while you're gone to hopefully allow the dog to not have to feel those feelings of separation anxiety. Anti-anxiety supplements, thunder shirts, aromatherapy, white noise machines, music. These are all things that can be helpful. I think when looking at most of this management stuff, it's nothing that's going to hurt the dog, so it's all worth a shot. Some of it may not help, but might as well give it a try.
And it's important when you are working diligently on, all right, what's my dog's current threshold? What have we been able to get to consistently? Is it 1 hour or 2 hours? If the owner is going to be gone longer than that, they're going to ruin all their progress. And so it's important that we be able to work with adopters to at least give them that understanding and make sure they have that flexibility so that, okay, well, we're going to be gone longer than their threshold, so what do we pull out? Do we have a friend come over? Do we get a dog sitter? We bring them a dog to daycare? Do we just bring them with us? But it's critical that they're making those smart decisions as they're working those thresholds up. We're at 3 hours, awesome. Oh man, but oh crap, I know I can't come home for lunch that day. All right, what do? Right, we can't go higher than that threshold. That's really critical when you're dealing with separation anxiety. All right, last behavior. Food guarding. What are we dealing with? Actually, not really much, because we don't really care about food guarding. It's kind of a trick slide. I never miss out an opportunity to shake everybody that we should not really care that much about food guarding. So we really don't spend a lot of time working on food guarding in shelter. We really don't believe it's a good use of your resources. There was that awesome study that Maddie's published that showed that it's the least predictive behavior when you're moving from context to context. So there's really no way to know the dog guarding in shelter is going to guard in the home, or from one home to the next, or if you're resolving it in shelter, if it's actually resolved in the home. And so if we're talking about just your run-of-the-mill food guarding, just don't bug him while he eats, right? That's more of a counseling management issue, more so than a training issue. Erica, one of my staff members, is here, and we had a fake hand the other day because we needed to check on, is this food guarding of this dog, like, within the bounds of normal? And man, people get so excited about food guarding assessments, and we were just like, hey, this is chill, it's not a big deal. But we've got to stop, like, spending a ton of resources trying to fix food guarding, okay? That's my rant, but this video is going to show you why we talk about that. This is, he's actually 12, by the way, but he is talking about the fact that they adopted this dog, Sydney, who just demonstrated food guarding in shelter. So this was at a time when we were doing evals. This is a shelter before APA.
She's very good dog. Not a bad one.
There's some good bites, right? Like those are some kind of uninhibited bites on the fake hand. We didn't really spend any time working on that behavior. This family actually adopted her despite our recommendation because they have a younger son too. And this is her in the home.
They understood.
So it was interesting. We had said no children, and they came in and insisted on Sydney. Sydney was a really cool dog. Out of that behavior assessment, really cool dog. And so we did not recommend her for them. They did like an 8-year-old as well. And they insisted on making them sign a waiver saying you're going against the recommendations of our behavior department. And when I was working on this presentation, this is from a few years back, I just went to the house, they let me come over to film this, and they never needed our help. She never, ever guarded in the home. But you saw how severe that was in shelter. And so that was kind of proof in the pudding for us. Like, we always felt like maybe we should be putting training resources towards this, and that really, I think, kind of cemented it. And then when that Maddie study came out, we were like, oh man, awesome. So this really should be something that we all kind of subscribe to. So in closing, you guys, really strive to differentiate shelter-created behavior and actual in-home history. When you're getting your owner surrenders, your returns, your foster returns, or just dogs in foster, spend the time really dissecting those notes, interviewing the people that lived with the dog. That's your best glimpse at how the dog behaved in a home environment, okay? And really strive to develop programs in shelter like DPFL playgroups, because playgroup really is the #1 way that we can triage and distinguish between the behaviors that are actually worth your training, right? Or that are just shelter created. And so none of us have time to do all the training that our dogs need. So offer that baseline, get them out, get them satisfied and de-stressed, and then you can actually figure out what is actually likely to be a behavior we need to work on that could occur in the real world, right?
Adoption follow-up program. So looking at how to allocate resources to make sure that we're providing dogs the support they need once they actually get home. So for certain behaviors that we're not necessarily seeing in shelter, once the dogs are at home, how do we give people resources to make sure that they can be successful once they're there? Whether that be via email, through training videos like EPA has started to implement, or through one-on-one training classes, those types of things. And that doesn't necessarily have to be staff-based. That could also be allocation of volunteers to be able to help with that work. Solid management. So let's just be realistic. The fact that we're likely not going to be able to train all of these dogs to be completely perfect and never display a behavioral issue in the future. But how do we provide these guys solid management that can be utilized fairly easily in a home, so that the normal person can take these animals home and keep them there and know how to do that safely and hopefully not worsen those behaviors while they're in that space.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes adopters need permission to like not be a professional trainer. You know, it's like it's okay if you'd rather put the dog away in the bedroom when people come over because you just don't have the schedule right now, or it's easier for you. That's okay as long as we're transparent at adoption, so they know what they're getting themselves into. We sometimes have to just help them pick their battles on training versus management, and management is extremely responsible. There has to be that component of that, and I think that they have to also be ready and willing to, especially we talk about this with fearful dogs, be ready and willing to be okay with certain. Hey, with training, we want that fearful dog to get here, and they should be able to go to your Game of Thrones party, but maybe they can't, right? And are you gonna be okay if they can't, right? Kind of being real about that. And then just lastly, I think if we're all striving so that the experience of our dogs while they're with us is really the best it can be, right? Something that always makes me extremely proud is seeing dogs go home, and they're going home, even if it's after much longer stay than we would ever want for a dog, but the time they were with us was extremely well spent. The day they went home, they were actually a better version of themselves than the day they got in, and that, I think, is what we should be striving for. So the time that they're with us, they're not developing behavioral problems that are keeping them in your shelter longer, resulting in their deaths, or resulting in actual behavior problems that they're gonna then do in the home because they went nuts in your shelter, and now they actually are having behavior problems that are in the home, but they learned it while they were with you. And so I think what I want you guys to do is that's the best bang for your buck, is making sure that the dogs in your care, regardless of if they have history or not, that you're attending them every day. They're getting out for playgroup, they're getting out with volunteers, they're getting out for really enriching activities so that they're learning to be better dogs, and then they'll go home and you're saving more lives and you're going to prevent behavioral problems from cropping up in the first place. And so I think that's the biggest takeaway, is just attend to your dogs every day, and you're gonna save more lives. The ones that have that behavioral history, hopefully we've given you some good tools, on how to practically, work through that stuff. And then that's our talk to you guys. So we'll hang out. I know we have just one question, so we'll hang out. I don't know if we're passing mics, but we're here.